welcome back to another episode of Principles of Micro. Today we are in Chapter 13, looking at oligopolies, and now we are turning our attention to game theory. So like I said in the introduction, game theory models strategic interaction where there is mutual interdependence. We established in the previous episode that with oligopolies, there can be cases where what you want to do depends upon what you think the other firm is going to do. So here's where I develop some tools to analyze those situations. So oligopolies are cases where game theory applies. Another example you might be familiar with is a group project at school. So back when I was undergraduate, group projects were very fashionable. The outcome depends upon not just on your own effort in the group project, but also on what your teammates are doing. So that's another case where game theory can apply. So why game theory is so useful for oligopolies is that firms, at least in the US, are not allowed to collude. So what they have to be worried about is that even without any explicit agreement or any kind of communication, could firms still end up cooperating and still end up charging prices that are similar to monopoly prices. We know from before that monopolies are bad for social welfare. So game theory is going to help us answer those kinds of questions. So every game has to have three elements for game theory to apply. There have to be players. So in this case, that would be firms that are in competition, and generally just be participants involved in some situation. That applies very generally. So games also have strategies in game theory. By that we just mean options available to the players. And the outcomes are what we call payoffs. And in game theory we say that the players are trying to maximize their payoff. So they're trying to get the best possible outcome they can for themselves. So some examples with oligopolies, the players are the firms that are competing in this industry. Strategies, each firm picks their own price and their quantity. And the payoff, the outcome of the game is going to be how much profit the firm makes. I mentioned earlier that a group project at school can also be modeled using game theory. The players in the game are you and the other people in your group. The strategies are how much work you're going to put into that group project. Are you going to spend a lot of hours on this, or are you just going to do something pretty quickly, an hour or two, and call it good enough? Those are among your strategies. The payoffs for you guys in the group project will be your grades. So as you can see, game theory is about much more than just board games. Of course, this kind of stuff also applies to games like checkers or bridge, stuff like that, but it also extends to many other applications. These are just a couple examples out of many. So the most famous example of game theory is what's called the prisoner's dilemma. So here's the story. There are several variations in the story. You might have heard a somewhat different version, but they end up having the same result. So let's say the cops have captured two criminals. They caught them on some relatively minor offense, and that could get them a year in prison if they just get convicted on that alone. Now the cops have suspicions and some evidence that the two people involved may have committed a much bigger crime. Unfortunately, though, the cops don't have proof that they've committed this much bigger crime. So they're trying to get the criminals to confess to the bigger crime. Of course, they have to have some kind of incentive to confess. So here's a deal that they offer the two criminals. So the criminals have been caught or offered this same deal, and they're being interrogated separately. The two prisoners cannot communicate to each other. They're in different rooms getting the same offer. So if nobody confesses, then they both get the 1 year in prison for that minor crime they have both been caught committing. So to incentivize them to confess, the deal is that if you confess and your partner does not, then you're going to go free. Will use your testimony against your partner to put them in prison for 20 years. Now the reverse also applies. If you stay silent, but they confess on you, we'll let them go free, and now you're going to be the one spending 20 years in prison. So they want to get at least one person to confess, but if they both confess, obviously they're not going to let them both go free. That would be just nonsense. If they both confess, both are going to get 12 years in prison. So I suggest you confess, the officer says, and let the prisoners think about it. So what's going to happen to each prisoner depends upon not just their own decision about do I confess or do I not confess. It also depends upon what does the other prisoner do. So there's mutual interdependence here. There's strategic interaction. That's why game theory applies. So the players are two prisoners, and the strategy is whether they confess or if they don't confess. The payoffs, the outcome of the game, is how many years they spend in prison. So here's how I can model that situation using game theory. So one common tool in game theory is to set up a table where each row or column corresponds to a strategy, one of the player's possible actions. And then in the cells of the table, you show what the payoffs are, that is, the outcomes for each player. So here's how this table represents our game. We said that if they both confess, they both will get 12 years in prison. So the confess cell is going to have payoffs of minus 12 each. So its payoffs are negative for how many years you are spending in prison. Now if neither one confesses, then both spend a year in prison. That's what our first sentence up here says. So that's going to be a payoff of negative 1. Negative 1 means 1 year in prison, so don't is going to have two negative 1s over here for the payoffs. So the other possibility is that if you confess, then you go free. That means 0 years in prison. If you confess, you go free. So if our prisoner here in red confesses, they get a 0. We will use our testimony to put your partner in prison for 20 years. So the prisoner in blue who picked don't confess will then spend 20 years in prison, so they get a negative 20. And it's symmetric in this scenario. Now game theory is not always symmetric, but this example happens to be symmetric. So if the prisoner in red, prisoner 1, is going to stay silent, if they don't confess, they get 20 years. And the prisoner 2, seen here in blue, who does confess, they go free, they get 0. So this table here corresponds to the scenario described in words in our prisoner's dilemma. So the table is called the normal form of the game, or the strategic form. And now we're going to try to figure out what will the prisoners do. It's a lot easier to analyze the game in a table rather than having to go through description and words. So what's going to happen? So we'll start by looking at prisoner 1. So prisoner 1 can try to figure out what's my best choice for each possibility. So let's say prisoner 1 thinks that prisoner 2 is going to confess. He doesn't know this for sure. They're being interrogated separately, but if he thinks this is happening, here's going to be his reasoning. So if prisoner 2 is confessing, they're going to be in this column over here in the table. So if I confess as well, they're going to be over here in this cell. We're both confessing. That means I get a payoff of negative 12. I get 12 years in prison. Well, that's not very nice. I don't like that at all. But what's the alternative? So if I think they're going to confess, and if I pick don't confess, and I'm prisoner 1, they're going to be in this cell. Prisoner 1's payoffs are in red, so prisoner 1 here is getting negative 20. That means I'm getting 20 years in prison. Well, that's even worse. I don't like either option here, but I'd much rather get just 12 years in prison rather than get 20 years in prison. So if I think prisoner 2 is going to confess, my best option is that I should confess as well. So that's one possibility. Now let's talk about the other one. What if I think that my partner, prisoner 2, is going to not confess? Maybe I think he's going to stay loyal to me. What should I do in that case? So if they don't confess, we're going to be in one of these two cells. If I confess and I'm prisoner 1 and they are not confessing, we're going to be over here. So I get to go free if I confess. I don't spend any time in prison at all. That's really nice. If instead I stay silent and they are also staying silent, they're also not confessing, then I'm going to get 1 year in prison. I don't want to go to prison. I'd rather get to 0 and confess. So if they don't confess, my best option is to confess. Now, again, the issue I've been thinking about is that they're being interrogated separately. I don't actually know what prisoner 2 is going to do. Nevertheless, this exercise is still quite useful. What we established is that in either case, it's better to confess. We said that if we think prisoner 2 is going to confess, our best option is to confess. If we think they're not going to confess, it's still better to confess. So no matter what they do, it's better for us to confess, so we're going to confess. So we call this a dominant strategy. So we call a strategy dominant if it leads to a better outcome for you no matter what your opponent is doing. So in this case, you're better off confessing whether or not your partner confesses. So confessing is a dominant strategy. So prisoner 1 is definitely going to confess. This game here is symmetric. You could apply the exact same logic to prisoner 2, and you'll find that prisoner 2 also wants to confess. So let us go through that in the table so you can understand how the table works. Let's say prisoner 2 thinks that the first prisoner is going to confess. So we're going to be in one of these two cells, this row in the table. So then if prisoner 2 also confesses, prisoner 2 gets negative 12, so 12 years in prison. If instead they're not confessing, while prisoner 1 is confessing, then prisoner 2 gets 20 years in prison. So prisoner 2 would rather confess in this case. So prisoner 2 tells himself, okay, if prisoner 1 confesses, I also want to confess. If I think they're going to confess, that is. Now, what if I think prisoner 1 is not going to confess? What should I do in that case? If prisoner 1 picks don't confess, we're going to be in this bottom row of our table. If I confess, if I'm prisoner 2, I get 0. If prisoner 2 does not confess, they're getting negative 1, they're getting a year in prison. They'd rather go free and get 0 than spend a year in prison. So if prisoner 1 is not going to confess, prisoner 2 also is going to prisoner 2 is going to confess. So either way, prisoner 2 is going to confess. So confess is a dominant strategy for prisoner 2 as well. Now here we get to the big result from the prisoner's dilemma. If the prisoners could somehow cooperate, what they'd rather do is agree to stay silent. They'd rather agree to both not confess. If they both not confess, they both get just 1 year prison each. However, when they're being interrogated separately, they can't cooperate. They're going to follow their own individual incentives. Their individual incentives are going to push them towards confessing. We said that confessing is a dominant strategy. It's always better to confess no matter what you think your opponent is going to do. So the cooperative outcome where they both don't confess and both get 1 year prison does not occur. Instead, you get this coordination failure and you get this worse outcome for both. When they both pursue their own individual incentives, it ends up being worse for both of them. That's the paradox of the prisoner's dilemma. So another very important tool for game theory is called the Nash Equilibrium. So while dominant strategies don't always exist, the Nash Equilibrium will exist under much more general conditions. So think of the famous mathematician John Nash. There's a movie about him called A Beautiful Mind. You might have seen that. So here's why the Nash Equilibrium is his big insight that revolutionized game theory. In Nash Equilibrium, no single player can change strategies and get a higher payoff. So it turns out that in the prisoner's dilemma, that outcome where they both confess, that's a Nash Equilibrium. So to be clear, the game is being played just once. They can't actually go back and change their moves. We're rather looking at, is the outcome going to be stable? If I knew this was going to happen, would I regret my actions? You can think of it that way. So if both players end up confessing, and we said they both will end up confessing here, can anyone deviate and get a higher payoff? So it's only one player at a time deviating. You can't both switch strategies simultaneously. So prisoner 1 cannot improve by changing strategies. So right now, prisoner 1 is confessing. They're both getting 12 years of prison. If prisoner 1 switches on their own to not confessing, now they're going to get 20 years of prison. That's worse. So prisoner 1 cannot improve their payoff by changing strategies. Now let's check for prisoner 2. Can they improve by switching strategies? The answer is no. So right now they're both confessing. They're both getting minus 12. If prisoner 2 switches to not confessing, then prisoner 1 is still confessing, so we're going to be in this cell of our table. Prisoner 2's payoff is going to fall from minus 12 to minus 20. They're now going to spend 20 years in prison instead of just 12 years of prison. So prisoner 2 would not want to do that. They'll say, I'm not going to switch strategies, I'm going to stick to confess. So even in advance, the prisoners knew that confess is going to happen. Neither one of them would want to change their strategies. That means this outcome is stable. That's why I call it an equilibrium, in particular, a Nash equilibrium. So confess is the Nash equilibrium. Let's check some of the other possibilities here. So one thing you want to look at is the cooperative outcome where they both don't confess. Where they both just stay silent and they both get the 1 year in prison for the minor offense. They don't get convicted for the bigger crime they committed. So that is actually not a Nash equilibrium. The problem is that a prisoner can change strategies and get themselves a higher payoff. So let's start looking at prisoner 1. So right now, they're both playing don't confess, don't confess. Prisoner 1 could switch to playing confess, and now they're getting a payoff of 0 instead of negative 1. That's because prisoner 2 is still playing don't confess. Remember, for Nash equilibrium, you look at only one player at a time changing their strategies. So prisoner 1 could get a higher payoff by changing their strategy to confess, so this outcome is not stable. This is not a Nash equilibrium. By the same logic, prisoner 2 could also improve their payoff by changing to confess. Right now, if both are don't confessing, they're both getting negative 1. If prisoner 1 is sticking to don't confess, prisoner 2 could switch to playing confess, and now prisoner 2 is getting 0. It's better to get 0 than get negative 1, so prisoner 2 will want to switch. So this outcome here, they're both playing don't confess. It's cooperative, but it's not stable, so it's not a Nash equilibrium. You can also verify that the two outcomes here on the diagonals are also not Nash equilibria. So let's say prisoner 1 is confessing and prisoner 2 is not confessing. So we're going to be in this part of the table. So prisoner 1 is getting 0, so they're going free. They're spending no time in prison, prisoner 2 is getting 20 years in prison. Is that stable? The answer is no. That's because prisoner 2 could get a higher payoff by changing strategies. So if prisoner 1 is still confessing, we're still in this row here, prisoner 2 could switch to playing confess, and now I'm going to move over here on the table. That means prisoner 2 gets negative 12 instead of negative 20. That's an improvement. So prisoner 2 does have incentive to change their strategies. So this outcome here is also not stable. By the same logic, this outcome over here is also going to be unstable and not a Nash equilibrium. So the unique Nash equilibrium is both players confess. So to find Nash equilibrium, you could go through that same process I just went through. You could look at each cell and see, can either side improve by changing strategies? The other way, which sometimes applies, again, there's not always a dominant strategy, but if there's a dominant strategy, then both players playing their dominant strategies will be the Nash equilibrium. So that could be a shortcut you can use sometimes. But again, you don't always have dominant strategies. Now, there's one important note here I got to include before I go on. Your book says that there is no Nash equilibrium when the player is randomized. That is definitely not true. There's something called a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, where the players are making a move at random. So one example you're probably familiar with is rock, paper, scissors. You probably play that game when you're a child, and as you know, the best strategy there is to make a move at random. You want to play rock 1/3 at a time, paper 1/3 at a time, and scissors 1/3 at a time. So you're randomizing, but that doesn't mean there's no Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is both players randomized with playing strategy with probability 1/3. Here's an even simpler example. You might play this game as well when you're a child. It's called odds and evens. So I'll make you the player here in red. Your strategy can show one finger or show two fingers. Your opponent is here in blue. They can show one finger or two fingers. So the total number of fingers is even, you win. So if you're both showing one, that means that you have two fingers being shown total. So if you're evens, then you win because you have a payoff of +1. Your opponent loses, they get a payoff of -1. Similarly, 2 is also going to be an even number. 2 + 2 is 4. That's even. In that case, you win. You get a payoff of +1. Opponent gets -1. Now your opponent wins if the sum is odd. So 2 + 1 is 3. So 2 + 1 is going to be over here. In that case, you lose. You get -1 payoff. And your opponent wins. We'll call that +1. Similarly, 1 + 2 is 3. So your opponent wins in that case. They get 1. You get -1. So this game has no Nash equilibrium in. Well, it has a Nash equilibrium. Let's be clear about that. But no, there's going to be randomization involved. So let's just verify that none of these outcomes are a Nash equilibrium. So if you're both playing 1, then you're going to be over here. So you're happy about that because 1 + 1 is 2. That's an even number. You win the game. You get a payoff of +1. Your opponent, though, is lost. They're getting -1, and this outcome is not stable. Your opponent could switch to playing 2, and now they would win. So if your opponent could get a higher payoff by changing strategies, this outcome is not stable. It's not a Nash equilibrium. So let's look at that outcome over here. What if you're playing 1 and they're playing 2? So we're going to be over here. 1 + 2 is 3. The opponent wins if it's an odd number, so you're getting -1, they're getting +1. This is also not a Nash equilibrium. That's because if they're playing 2, you could also switch to playing 2, and now you're down here. So this is what happens if they're playing 2 and you're playing 2. 2 + 2 is 4, so in that case, you'd win. So you'd want to change your strategies if this happened. So this outcome is also not stable. 2, 2 is also not stable. So here 2 plus 2 is 4, even number, so you win. So the opponent's going to want to try to deviate so you don't win anymore. So right now the opponent's getting -1. If you keep playing 2 and they switch to playing 1, now they're going to win. They're going to pay a +1, so they're going to want to change their strategies. This outcome is also not stable. And lastly, when you're playing 2 and they're playing 1, we're over here, that's also unstable because you want to play 1 instead and raise your payoff to 1 from -1. So no single outcome here is stable. There's no Nash equilibrium in these cells. The Nash equilibrium is going to be, it still exists though. Nash equilibrium is going to be you both randomize. You're going to play either 1 or 2 with probability 50% each. So there is a Nash equilibrium. Your book is incorrect when it says there's no equilibrium here. So that's our tools from game theory. In our next episode, we're going to apply those tools to looking at oligopolies.